Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why are you so serious?
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Oh, welcome to this podcast review for September 24th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation, which is about to get wild. We have taken the substance. I'm sure our duplicates will show up anytime.
I wonder what our other selves actually look like. I'm really creeped out by that notion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even want to fathom what that would be like. My younger self would probably it certainly wouldn't do anything as we see in the movie. I think my younger self would just go back to playing hockey.
That certainly proves the movie's thesis if we're thinking about taking the substance when we're not even 40 years old yet. Like that.
No. I don't think I need it yet. I'm fine.
We'll
see.
Give it about 2 more years, right?
Exactly. Very looking forward to discussing the substance, and I'm also excited that we are not alone in this conversation. We have a really wonderful guest joining us for this episode. First time on the show is the wonderful Matt Minton. Matt, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me. Super excited.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad to have you here. It's interesting. I had reached out to a mutual friend, Kenzie from Off Screen Central. Mm-hmm. She said, you need to get Matt on the show. And I said, I will do that. And I went to reach out to you, and it turns out that you are a previous winner of a giveaway we did once, which I had totally forgotten about. And that was a lovely
track
surprise.
Of all of them.
Exactly. So that was a wonderful surprise. But yeah, it's great to have you here. I'm excited to get your thoughts on this film. I guess before we get into it, though, Matt, I wanted to ask you what your relationship with Coralie Fargeat might be. Were you anticipating the substance at all? Was this on your radar? Were you anticipating this film?
Absolutely. This was easily one of my most anticipated of just the fall festival season. I watched Revenge. I think I rented it from the library like a year after it came out, and I didn't love it, but I was really interested in it, and I was definitely clued in to see where this director would go next. I'm a really big body horror fan. I love Titane and Cronenberg, so I was very excited for this. And I've managed to catch it at TIFF, and I loved it. Spoiler alert, I love the movie so much that I ended up going to see it for a second time. So I'm very excited to see.
You stomached it twice. Good for you. Good for you.
I wondered if it would be a little too much. I don't know. A third time might be a lot, but I think two. I can handle
Seems
two.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, just don't see it at a movie tavern. You don't need a meal when you're watching something like this.
Sure. Brendan, remind me, how did you feel about Revenge when that came out?
Oh, I really liked it.
Okay.
I liked it a lot. In fact, it's interesting because I recall our review of that film, JD, where you and I both really liked it, and yet it led to one of our biggest disagreements we've ever had on the show in a weird way. And for those listening, for some context, JD and I rarely actively disagree, and even when we do, it's sort of like that's a good point, I buy that, but I don't fully agree. We're very polite about it, but for some reason Revenge led to kind of an argument, even though we both really liked the movie, which is really weird. Long story short, I really like that movie, and anytime someone mentions the subgenre body horror as related to new release movies, I get excited because I just feel like we don't get much of those anymore, and when we do, they're not really true body horror in the way of like a David Cronenberg, like you mentioned earlier, Matt. So just that idea alone had me at least intrigued for the substance and to see what Coralie Fargeat was going to do next.
Yeah, and to echo what Brendan was saying there in terms of how he and I share the same brain, if you're listening to this and you haven't listened to episode 603, the main show that came out this week, I urge you to go and listen to that top 10 because, and it's not anything Brendan and I planned, but you'll see just how aligned we can be sometimes. It was very funny.
Whenever we do any top 10 list in any category, whatever it is, best of the year, best whatever this thing is, we're always going to have some type of crossover. Not in that way, the type of crossover we dealt with on that particular top 10 you're talking about, JD, on episode 603. It's pretty hilarious. It's pretty
funny.
hilarious.
It's very funny. So that will certainly give you some evidence as to what Brendan is talking about. So anytime we can find room to offer some disparity, we tend to find it. We definitely
we're at the point we're trying to look for it sometimes.
Yeah. I also really liked Revenge. I will, I guess, regurgitate this as well. For any new listeners out there, my relationship with the horror genre is an interesting one, a complicated one. I did not really grow up on horror films. It's not something that was part of my cinematic diet for a long time, partially because I'm a big scaredy cat, or at least was. I feel like I've certainly come around the corner in a lot of ways, but over the last 10 years or so, though, it's really become a genre that I've really loved. But I think because I was so distant from it for a while, like body horror especially is something that I'm still catching up on some of them. I've seen a lot of the David Cronenberg films, the John Carpenter films that kind of fall into this subcategory here. So Titan, another great example. That was a fascinating film from a few years ago. So I don't know if I seek them out as much as a lot of others do, but I'm certainly not opposed to them. And I don't know if I would have said that, 11 years ago when we first started the show. So
you came of age. You certainly
very
did.
much so.
Yeah, when you're a film critic, coming of age means accepting body horror. That's the definition of it there.
And admittedly, I wasn't too aware of the substance. I'm not even sure if it was something we brought up at the beginning of the year, Brendan. It might have. I'm not really too sure. But even so, it wasn't really on my radar until people started talking about it. The critics, they got to see it at the festivals, the early reviews, and people were absolutely raving for it. So it immediately got my attention, and I was very excited to see what the hype was all about. So with all of that said, I guess we'll go ahead and jump in. We'll start with non-spoilers. Perhaps at a certain point we can jump into spoilers because the film is quite wild. It goes through some really interesting territory.
It goes places.
It goes places, and perhaps we could talk about that in detail here in a little bit. So with that laid out, if you guys are ready, I think we can go ahead and jump into the substance here. Written and directed by Coralie Fargeat, and it stars Demi Moore, Margaret Qualley, Dennis Quaid, and that's really it. There are certainly others that come and go throughout the film, but that'll probably be the trio we focus on for this conversation. If you're not familiar with the substance, a fading celebrity decides to use a black market drug, a cell-replicating substance that temporarily creates a younger, better version of herself. All right, let's jump into this. Matt, I know you've already spoiled it, but if you want to expound on your thoughts there, what do you think about the substance?
Yes, I absolutely love this film. I think it uses the body horror genre in a really interesting way. I think for me, especially when I saw it again, what really stood out to me is that this movie manages to really go places. It gets really over the top. It's really operating at a heightened reality. But I think there's just this deep, very, very sad core to it from the very beginning that never really went away from me. I felt like, especially in Elizabeth, played by Demi Moore, who is the actress who is kind of out of the limelight. She sort of, has a really complicated relationship with her body, with how she perceives herself. Her character, there's just such a deep sadness to her, but I feel like even when the film goes so over the top and it's hilarious to watch at times, I feel like that core of her character kind of stuck through till the very end. And was sort of what gave the film deeper meaning. Because obviously, as many people have talked about, some critically, that this is not a film that's interested in subtlety or any sort of nuance in the slightest. And I think you do kind
Can't
of
help
have
but
to,
laugh, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
you do have to, I feel like, going into it, for people who haven't seen it, I would say go into it, knowing that framework at least. Like, this is not a film that's trying to be subtle. This is not a film that has a lot of subtext. This is a film that is going to try to get the most visceral reaction out of you possible. And for me, that just absolutely worked. And I don't know, like I said, third time might be a lot, but I think this is also just such a great crowd movie. Like, this is a film to watch with a sold out audience, with a midnight audience.
Sure.
That really made the experience too for me.
Yeah. This movie rocks. This movie rocks. The most, I guess, eloquent way I can put it is that this movie rocks is the best way I can say it. I love what you're saying there, Matt, is that there is this emotional core to the film that is very surprising given how over the top that it is. And that is certainly true. And I do want to touch on that in just a little bit, but one thing that I did not expect this movie to do, and I've heard a lot of the rumblings about, it's going to go places you're not ready for. It's going to take you by surprise. You're going to have a very visceral and grotesque reaction to it. And the people who marketed the film, who praised the film in that way, they're not wrong. But there are two things about the film that genuinely surprised me that I didn't really hear talked about enough. One of them is that there are actually a lot of long stretches where this almost functions like a silent film, where there's very little dialogue, which genuinely took me off guard, where it's really just both Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley acting in a way that's through gestures and facial communication as opposed to verbal communication, which is very impressive. And the other thing, too, this movie is really funny. Like there are major pockets where I thought this might be the best comedy of the year. And it's because it is so over the top. And yet I don't think it ever loses that sadness you're talking about there, Matt, which is why Coralie Fargeat's direction, I think, really is the standout. And some of the best things here are really due to her vision and how she's able to manage tonal control. As far as tone management, I think it's one of the most impressive films of the year, which is why I think it's pretty surprising it ended up winning the Best Screenplay award at the Cannes Film Festival. And that's not to knock the screenplay, but this really is more of a director's exercise, a performative piece than anything else. The film is not subtle. Thematically speaking, it's very on the nose. It's very blunt in a similar way that almost reminds me of like a Darren Aronofsky. It's not hiding anything. But I appreciate that. It's really, as you said, Matt, it's there to create a reaction out of you as opposed to get you to think overly deeply about what its themes are. It's not as interested in that, even though it does have a lot of great things on its mind that we can certainly talk about. But I did have a reaction to it, and I had fun. I had fun with this. I can't wait to see it again because I may, like you, Matt, latch on to that sadness even more, and it may even feel like a different experience on the second go around, which I'm really looking forward to experiencing.
Yeah, this is one of the most blistering films of the year, hands down. It's one of the most brazen, confident, expressive, and beautifully grotesque films I've seen in quite a long time, though filmmaking by Coralie Fargeat is unflinching and audacious. It's blunt, as you guys are talking about. I mean, there is not an ounce of subtlety here. I completely agree. And I love that about this film. It's very clearly acting as a modern day fairy tale, and its convictions are so fervent that I think being understated would have been the wrong approach, especially when beauty standards and our infatuation with youthful complexion is such a deep rooted aspect of our cultural ethos. It's something that affects us all in one way or another. And the idea that our insecurities manipulate us into thinking we are monsters is incredibly potent. It's not a new idea per se, but when we live in an Ozempic manic world with social media beauty parameters creating these unrealistic standards, those themes have never been more paramount. So as a way to emphasize a sense of urgency, the film is as loud and batshit crazy as possible. It's blood-drenched spectacle that would make both David Cronenberg and John Carpenter leap for joy. I'm sure we'll talk much more about that as we go here, but the film is very assiduous in its fairy tale storytelling, and I absolutely loved every moment of it. Demi Moore, career best performance, perhaps? certainly arguably, it reminded me a lot of Robert De Niro in The Irishman, and how that performance is ultimately a deconstruction of his career and the characters that made him into a movie
there's
star.
a meta component here for sure.
That is a
Demi
lot
Moore.
of what this is for Demi Moore as well, as she's playing this aging actress who was known for beauty in her youth. So it's very meta in that regard. It has the same deconstructionist foundation that I think is so striking. Margaret Qualley continues to be one of the most fascinating actresses of her generation. Her brave, commanding performance here is simply one of the best of the year. And of course, their dynamic throughout the film it's just remarkable. I'm with you guys. This was a breathtaking experience for sure.
Yeah, and you have to give Demi Moore a lot of credit for simply taking on this role, because you imagine that pitch as if someone were to approach her and say, so yeah, we recognize you were once a very well-regarded actress. Do you want to also play one that has also been kind of forgotten and, sort of fade into obscurity? It's like there is that meta component there. And you can almost sense that Demi Moore herself is maybe channeling some deep-rooted realism into this performance, which is where that sadness you were talking about in your opening thoughts, Matt, certainly rings true. The performances here really do bring that pathos, which is very surprising. And even though the movie might not be necessarily... I'm trying to be careful when I say the movie's not deep, because that's not really the case here. It does have a lot of interesting ideas on its mind. It may not make you think about them in the same way that a more nuanced film might, but the film visualizes that obsessive quality for body image in a way that does lead to a very visceral reaction. It's this perfect idea that sometimes theme doesn't necessarily need to be something you think about. It's something you feel. And this is a film that tries to make you feel those things. And it did get me thinking about that in a way that made me have a visceral reaction to it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think another thing that really stood out to me was the editing, especially once she, starts taking, the titular substance, and you have oftentimes the film will flash kind of reminders on the screen, right? Of course, not getting into spoilers, but, the film very clearly lays out, the rules. It's very simple, which I think is effective. The rules of, you have to inject this many times. You have 7 days in this body, 7 days in the other body. And as the film kind of goes on, there are a lot of times where the editing just kind of jolts you out of the film for a second. And I think that was very intentional. It just keeps the film's pace going. It has a very kind of electric pace that I was just really drawn into.
This is a great way to put it. It's like this movie's being charged every single step of the way. Yeah.
It has an incredible energy. I agree. The pacing is wonderful. I mean, for a film that's nearly 2.5 hours, 220 something in that realm. It's not a short movie by any means, but it didn't feel long to me. I was wholly engaged with the film throughout its entirety, and I absolutely loved the electricity that is built into the filmmaking here and the spectacle that is much of the back half of the film, especially. In addition to the production and the camera work here, which I think is really quite excellent. Again, the references and the callbacks are not subtle either. You think of the studio hallway, which is a very clear reference to The Shining, or the depot where Elizabeth gets the supplies is straight out of 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the production, I think it's engrossing, even again, if those references aren't subtle. And when you look at the camera work, it's fascinating to see the film lean into its provocative nature. This is a film that is really going to hurt the feelings of those that really do not like sex and nudity in their films, because there's a lot of nudity here, but it quintessentially exhibits why sex and nudity is not just acceptable, but necessary when it comes to art. The close-ups on Moore and Qualley, the way it lingers on their bodies, is, for one, vital to denoting how each of them view their own bodies, speaking of Elizabeth and Sue. But secondly, the workout images are a major aspect to the film's farcical commentary on TV executive fetishism and exploitation. The way Harvey and his pervy stockholders worship youthful vigor is is obviously tapping into the cruelty that women experience in the entertainment industry. So the evocative imagery here is extremely important. And there's a lot of it that I thought was utilized well, not just in terms of the film's fun and entertainment, but in terms of the thematic exercise of this film, it's very assiduous in complementing the ideas that it's it's trying to articulate.
And of course, his name is Harvey. That's all I'll say.
I don't think that was a very carefully
that is
chosen
not
name.
an accident. It's not an accident at all. But Dennis Quaid commits to the evil nature of Harvey as a character in this movie, and I have to give him credit for his performance as well. If there's any moment in the movie that I guess crosses over into like really like true horror, it's this one moment maybe midway through where Sue is doing this specific dance, and let's just say something happens to her buttocks, I'll simply say. And that's not the moment that's frightening, or even the moment in the bathroom afterwards. It's how apparently the producers and the cameraman all noticed it. So they put it on a giant screen and instantly replay it over and over again. And you see all of these men watching her butt on replay. That's probably the most, like, I guess, like pure moment of visceral horror, true horror that this movie has, at least in a way that maybe is a bit more self-serious by comparison, but it's the right one. Like, I feel like if there is one moment that's going to take itself a bit more seriously, it is that one, and it is the right one. And again, it leads to a visceral reaction that I definitely fell for. And I thought it was really great.
Yeah. And again, it's the imperfection of it, right?
Yeah.
Because she had no problem exhibiting her body on camera beforehand, but the moment there's a slight imperfection, that's when her insecurities come to the surface.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not arguing that there's any subtlety there. There isn't, but I did find that effective.
Lack of subtlety is not a bad thing. No.
I think it works here. Yeah.
Yeah. You can feel themes, and that's all that matters sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that scene also does a really good job of just making you as the viewer, as a spectator, feel like you're invading their body. Like the camera work is very close up. It just makes you as a viewer feel very uncomfortable yourself. It makes you feel implicated in it as well, which I think is really effective and adds to that.
Like you're part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think ultimately that's where I agree so much with what you're saying, Matt, in your opening thoughts, as far as the sorrow of this film and the sadness that comes to mind. Honestly, when I walked out, the first thing I thought about was that 1931 James Whale Frankenstein movie. I think there's a lot of comparisons to be made to that film.
Good point. Good point.
From its obvious commentary on beauty, I think, when you look at this film through the prism of that film, which is haunting, that 1931 film is haunting. There's a deep underlying sorrow that gives the film a tragic pathos. There's sympathy to be had for Frankenstein and his monster. And I think the show achieves the same thing here with this film. There's equally a vivid sorrow that heightens its symbolism and themes. The pain and longing we see in Demi Moore's performance is astounding, especially in that moment in front of the mirror where she wipes the makeup from her face. It is such a heartbreaking scene in this film. And for Sue, her whole existence is born out of obsessive youth and getting revenge, so to speak, on the systemic stereotypes that put a cap on age and beauty. So it's her whole identity. And when that, I'll say vaguely, is taken away at a certain moment, I think there's a similar poignancy to be had. So like Frankenstein and his monster, the film shows a tender empathy toward its characters and the heartbreaking consequences that come about as the fairy tale unfolds is really opulent and really felt. Going back to that word and the argument you're making there, Brendan. Again, I didn't really care how blunt this film is. Sometimes you need to be effective for it to be felt. You need to stand on a pedestal and clash pans together and be as loud as possible. Yeah. Especially when we live in an internet age where that's really the only way to get through on something like the internet or social media.
And sometimes a filmmaker earns the right to be a bit more blunt in his or her themes when when there are other factors happening here that still invest you as an audience member. And in this case, like, I was genuinely invested in Elizabeth/Sue, and there is a sadness because of both of their respective performances. That bathroom scene that you're highlighting there, JD, I do think is. I mentioned the butt on replay scene is maybe the one moment of real true horror. That scene's maybe the one moment of real true drama. I mean, there are other moments certainly sprinkled in, but that's maybe where it's the most literal
It's
by
devastating.
definition.
It's pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And Demi Moore does sell it. So to call this maybe her best performance of her career, I think that is an argument we can make, especially given the fact, as we talk about, it's kind of a reflection on Demi Moore the person, as opposed to just being a performance by Demi Moore. So there is that meta component to it that definitely adds to that visceral reaction we're all having to it.
Yeah, and perhaps we can get into spoilers here or kind of transition there, because there is one image in the back half of this film that I do want to highlight as it relates to Elizabeth. And again, to reiterate, this is a character that is clearly struggling with insecurity and self-hatred. Her reaction to being thrown out somewhat randomly, at least from her perspective, is really quite poignant. She becomes desperate that at one point she clings on to the words of a former middle school classmate that she clearly hadn't seen in years. And she agrees to go out with him. And it's clear that she isn't really interested in him, but if he's willing to give her the acceptance she's looking for, she's willing to indulge. That is, of course, what leads to that mirror moment and why it's so heartbreaking as she's wrestling with that duality. And so it leads to the ending of this film. And the individual image that really strikes a chord with me, that I think is so moving, and it's simply Elizabeth, or what's left of her, because by the time we get to this moment, she's pretty unrecognizable.
Yeah.
But she's lying on the ground in a pool of her own blood. And what's so moving to me about it is that all she wanted was to be wanted, to be accepted and viewed as beautiful regardless of her age. There's something so innocent and human about that, but instead her desires for youth devour her. Again, say what you will about how blunt the commentary is, but I did find that watching Sue attack her so relentlessly was deeply devastating to me. And as that whole scene crystallizes, it starts up as a little close up, it pans up a little bit, and you simply see Elizabeth there, still in that pool of blood that surrounds her. And that one image, watching her youth completely eat her away, I found it breathtaking here.
Yeah.
Nearly fell out of my seat.
Yeah, and just the idea that it came as a result in a very ironic way, because all she wanted to do, as you said, JD, feel loved for her, really, just for who she was. And in this process, through this experience, through taking this substance, which, I mean, this really is kind of a drug addiction movie in many ways too. It certainly visualizes it in that way. But the more that she divulges into it, the more she disassociates from herself and learns to love herself even less. And that becomes ultimately the downfall that you're talking about there.
Well,
too.
and it's a battle, right? Because there is the moment where she attempts to kill her younger self, as you're saying, maybe accepting that, hey, look, there's been some pretty heavy consequences here, but I'll accept that this is who I am at this moment in my life.
There's
but then
slow,
she completely reverts against it, though.
There's a slow disassociation happening gradually throughout the film, as if there is this synergy between the two of them, Elizabeth and Sue, but eventually it gets to a point where we as an audience recognize, oh, they're really two different people now. Like, they are completely separate now. And watching that unfold is very interesting.
Yeah. That whole scene where they're fighting each other was just heartbreaking. And especially just the line when Elizabeth, she's looking at Sue, and she's like, I forget what the exact line is, but it's like, you're the only good thing that's left of me. Like, I need you. Like,
Yeah.
she realizes
Yeah. Yeah.
she can't just
Yeah.
accept
Ah,
she can't accept how she looks. She has to keep going. And that to me was just absolutely heartbreaking.
yeah. Yeah. I completely
Mhm.
agree. And that leads to some, I don't even know if I have the words to articulate where it goes from
You
there.
you mentioned Frankenstein as more of a
Yeah.
thematic comparison. There's a very
Yeah.
literal
A
Frankenstein
literal.
component.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a
It's like this
monster
weird
that is created. Yeah.
yeah, it's like Monstro Elizasu. I think the name
Yeah.
splashes on the screen, and that's the moment I knew it's like, okay, maybe it is okay to laugh at this a little bit, because like Coralie Fargeat is really going over the top with the visuals here that you almost can't help but chuckle at just how insane it gets.
Yeah.
And that's something I like about it. I think some people may have very different reactions to that too, and that's perfectly fair. But I mean, I appreciated how over the top that it was, to the point that I was
Yeah.
so hard pressed to call this a horror comedy in a way. And I like that
Brendan,
about it.
we've talked about in recent months, certainly this year, the
Mhm.
idea that the mustache twirly villain is no longer a criticism that I can accept. I
Sure.
can't, because we see those individuals in real life all of the time, especially in 2024. So the fact that this film kind of leans into that as, hey, these people do exist. It is this ridiculous. So let's comment on that absurdity,
Well,
and
and
let's take it as far as we possibly can.
And I'm not saying it's false. I'm just saying it's so over the top that you can't help but laugh sometimes.
Well,
there
I
is
know.
like
And-
yeah.
And,
But a lot of times, like, the over the top nature is also due to the filmmaking, due to the heightened
Yeah,
music,
yeah.
the heightened editing. It's really just the tonality of how over the top that it is, that you almost have
Yeah.
that kind of other reaction to it. But like a good filmmaker knows how to get a reaction, and it has to be the right reaction. I think this is the right reaction.
yeah, I agree. Matt, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just as the film, as the film goes on, especially, if we're talking about that whole ending sequence, which I think the moderator at the Toronto screening was like, you think this film has reached how far it's going to go, and it's just going to keep going and going. And I think that's a great way to put it, because
The Energizer Bunny.
there's at least 6
Yeah.
times where I'm like, okay, I think this is like the tipping point, and it just keeps going and going.
Yeah.
But the film just get so wrapped up in it. There's that moment, of course, when oh my God, I don't know how to pronounce the name of the monster at the end. Monstro,
I think it's Monstro Elizasu. Is that what it
Monstro
is?
Elizasu. I think that's
It might
right.
be
Yeah,
something
something
like
like
that. Yeah,
that.
it's certainly a fusion happening there.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like we said, literal Frankenstein moment.
Yeah.
When she puts when she puts Elizabeth's cutout over her face, and everyone in everyone, she walks back into the building, and everyone just goes along with it. I was just like, I'm here for it. And then then the reveal that, oh, she's twirling around in that that shining like kind of room. It got to a point where I was just ready to go wherever the film was going to go in terms of
I was on its wavelength.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it very much reminded me of Frankenstein in that regard. When you think about how that film ends and the tragedy of it all, I think there are very similar things happening here with that monstrosity. That, again, it's crazy, it's wild, and admittedly, I think where perhaps some of the humor comes from for me is that, again, going back to something you said earlier, Brendan, people kept reiterating you're not ready for where this film goes. I wasn't exactly sure where that threshold would come. And when we see Elizabeth transform as she does, I guess before we get to the Monstro Elizasu moment, for me, I was thinking, okay, this must be what everyone's talking about with the makeup work and how blistering that is here, and it leads to that final death of Elizabeth, as I noted earlier. I simply assumed that's what people were talking about, and then nope, there's a whole nother section to this film.
There's a whole
I was
nother
like,
act.
oh, they're really
we
pushing
get that
the boundaries.
we get that brief mirror shot of the introduction of Monstro Lizasu.
Yeah, that's a great moment.
I want to start a band and call it that. I really do.
It's fantastic.
But that initial shot, yeah.
Yeah, and that's really great. But I also think about, again, the sorrow that's underneath. I know that there's so much batshit wild nonsense that's happening on the surface. And in terms of the film's entertainment and fun, there's a lot of, stimulating things happening there that's arresting to watch. But I do think, and going back to something you said earlier, Brendan, in terms of the tonal management here, and maybe that is Fargeat's greatest achievement, because while there's certainly a lot to be hypnotized about with what's happening on the surface there in those final moments, but I also just kept going back to the whole Frankenstein sorrow of it all. Like, I couldn't help but see that creature and feel deep empathy, knowing the context of what led to that creature existing in the first place, and everyone treating it as it is, as it is a Frankenstein monster, and that we have to kill this thing, which they try to do, right? And it leads to this bloody affair. And I just found the film's themes and its commentary on beauty standards and how insecurities can lead to this because of these expectations that are presented and set, that I found that, again, while extremely blunt, I was hypnotized by the emotional vigor of it. And I found myself leaning more to the sorrow, honestly, more than I guess the energy of it and the blood spectacle of it. I was having less fun maybe some others were, because I was more deeply moved by what Fargeat was trying to achieve there on a thematic level.
Yeah, and it's interesting because by the end, it gets to a point where you start to forget you're looking at a monstrosity in that final act. It's really almost a fourth act in many ways. It's like this final tag. It's almost like this extended like monstrous epilogue of sorts. It gets to a point where you forget you're looking at this monstrosity, and you're just looking at the fusion of two sad people, really. And at
that's
first
how I felt about it.
Well,
which is crazy,
right,
because like the creature goes on stage, it has like this printed out poster on its face, which is inherently,
it's funny given the fact, like you said that, like the whole audience just goes along with it. They don't even notice that there's something weird about this.
Yes,
which in a way says a lot about the mindset of the people in the audience. Just the stupidity of everyone there.
Exactly.
So like that's funny. That's really funny.
It is like there's an inherent humor to that again is effective, but beyond the mask is something that I think is really poignant. And what I kept thinking about that. Yeah. And
what I want to comment on quickly, and then I'll let you jump in, Matt. There was a moment in that fourth act, as I'm calling it, that like I said, I started to forget I was looking at this creature, this newly rebirthed thing, and I was just looking at the fusion of two sad people. And at first I thought, is it because we're just getting too much of this grotesqueness that it's starting to become a little numbing? But that's not the case at all. It's because you're forgetting that you're looking at a monster and you're looking at people. Like that's the reaction of the movie that I think is so affecting. And while I think Frankenstein is perhaps the most accurate comparison to make, I agree with you there, JD. In the moment, I was thinking about the Elephant Man. That was the first one that came to mind, especially in the train scene in that film from David Lynch. The whole "I'm not an animal, I'm a human being" line that's very iconic from John Merrick. That's what I was thinking about. But I think that's it demonstrates the power that the movie has and how it's working ultimately.
Yeah.
I think because the film has such a, when you're thinking of the pace of the first 20 minutes versus the last 20 minutes, the film really starts off, you're really just getting to know Elizabeth from the very beginning. You're getting to empathize with her, with her struggles. And the film just has this very just gradual, from the very start, from the very end to the very end, you can see this very gradual sort of path to how that monstrosity is formed at the end. So as you're mentioning, like, when you're watching that final sequence, like, I can't unsee that it's Elizabeth and Sue in there. Like because you've seen their journey from the very beginning of the film. And I feel like the film is so well paced that you sort of see this evolution of their bodies from the very beginning. And as we've sort of talked about too, I think how smartly the film sort of uses what you know about Demi Moore's career. I think it's I don't think the film doesn't spend too much time getting into like, what films this, Elizabeth worked on in her career. It just sort of invites you to bring in what you know from the actual industry and world around you. And I think that sort of adds to, the film's commentary. It's obviously so blunt, but because everything from the very beginning, you're thinking about, oh, this is relating to Demi Moore's career. I think Fargeat is automatically getting you to think about how this film is really just about what is going on around us in the entertainment industry, especially for us who are, super into film and television. And I've seen actors like Demi Moore, and I've seen the way that older actresses, get unfairly treated for years. I think because the film invites us to think about how it's relating to the real world from the very beginning, it just makes it all the more sad at the very end.
Sure.
Even when, blood is gushing everywhere, it's just, you just can't unsee how this is really the person that we were still watching from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I immediately was in tune with that. I think that's why earlier, and perhaps as this conversation goes, I think to maybe even compound on that further, because Brendan, you invoked Aronofsky earlier, and I guess maybe a fair way to articulate Coralie Fargeat's filmmaking here is that it is blunt like an Aronofsky film. It's audacious and bold in a similar way, but it has the maturity of late era Scorsese infused with it that you don't really get with Aronofsky. So it's as if she's taking the best of the craft and the filmmaking abilities of an Aronofsky, but the thematic and emotional maturity that we've seen with late era Scorsese. Because that's what I really loved about The Irishman. It's what I loved about De Niro's performance in that film, and how it's commenting on his career in many respects. And that meta component with Demi Moore is really striking. And I think she wonderfully taps into that with this lush beauty that really gives the film this beating heart that I really do love. And while we haven't talked as much about Margaret Qualley here, I think she's equally
she's
fantastic
mesmerizing.
in this film.
She's hypnotizing in this thing.
Yeah,
she really is.
It really is. I mean, the brazen confidence she gives Sue is remarkable. There is equally an urgency to that character. She's desperate, but for Sue, it's about weaponizing her beauty to make the most of it, certainly to counteract the Harvey, TV executive, I guess like perviness that we get with those characters.
For sure.
And then because of some of the choices that she makes, there are these devastating effects that as Sue begins to unravel within those consequences, Qualley taps into that in these really striking ways that I think is fantastic. I mean, those kind of last moments before she walks into the bathroom, before we get to the monstrosity at the end. I mean, that's, some of the more vivid imagery of the film as well. I mean, you think about that moment when she, speaking of Harvey, when she runs into Harvey and those stockholders there in the hallway. I mean, that's also one of the
that
more
fake smile. Yeah, there's a lot of pain there. Yeah, we talk about how this movie really isn't very nuanced at all, but the performances kind of are. I think that's why the film does kind of work. Like I mentioned earlier, that there are many moments here. There are many stretches where it almost feels like a silent movie, where there's very little dialogue. And while I like that approach, I think that's a very bold and daring approach for a movie like this. It does pinpoint where the nuance of this movie actually is. It's conveyed very cryptically in gestures and facial expressions without telling you things, even though what the film is suggesting overarchingly is not subtle at all. But the way it gets us to feel about that is pretty complex. And I think a lot of that really is due to both Demi Moore and, as you're talking about there, Judy, especially Margaret Qualley.
Yeah. And I think that's where the nuance of this film really does lie for me. It's blunt, it's not subtle, but I wouldn't call this shallow. It's not hollow.
No,
I do
it's
think
not.
there is depth here.
There is
But
depth. It's just it chooses to convey that depth in a way that's, let's say, not. It's not like a Terrence Malick film, right? Which gets you, yeah. That's a different level of communicating, deepness, I guess. Yeah, it's just a very different way of communicating that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's just not subtext. It's kind of on the surface, but there is texture to it, and I think that distinction needs to be made, and we're not articulating that clearly enough because I do think there is sufficient texture to this film, and it certainly comes through in the performances for sure. It's in the visual storytelling of this film. It's in something like the use of food here. Speaking of off-screen central, there was that viral tweet from Jillian going around yesterday as we're recording this, where she said something about the substance with Elizabeth using her own insecurities with food and doing that purposefully to cause harm to Sue because she knows how that will affect her relationship with the younger self. That is a very astute observation that was confirmed by Fargeat herself, which I thought was really fascinating. But it is compelling in this film to see Elizabeth fight back by overindulging on food, knowing that it will affect or get Sue to react. And there's, of course, the irony that their whole public persona is built around not just beauty, but fitness, something that certainly adds to their insecurities and the overall texture of this film. And that's not something that the film, to me, that is one of the, least blunt aspects of this film. I don't think it overly shoves that in our face, but it presents it through visual storytelling and lets these performers react. And that, I think, is one of the more compelling aspects of this film and that specific dynamic between those two characters.
Yeah, because it doesn't condemn fitness necessarily as just its own thing. It just it's more the obsessive qualities and how that leads to that body image obsession that we're talking about, the after effect, the post effect, and something like that. I think it's really interesting how both Elizabeth and Sue, the film almost seems to suggest that they became stars because they led fitness programs, because that's the thing they're trying to promote. So I think in and of itself, that's actually kind of funny. But it's not directly antagonizing the thing that they're promoting. It's just the way that people look at it as something that they need to strive for. That's the problem.
Yeah, I thought the use of food was really interesting in the film, like from the beginning with Dennis Quaid's character. That really,
that close up,
that scene where he's just
never
like
eating
mushing
shrimp again.
That scene was just from the beginning, just like the sound you hear him crunching, and it was just so nasty. But I feel like that really they set up like that idea well, and then as you mentioned, when Elizabeth starts cooking all of that food, I felt like that was a nice callback. I was like, okay, this was set up earlier. And I feel like just another one of the most just sad parts of the film is just like seeing Elizabeth and Sue be pitted against each other, and just how far they will go. Once they start, double dipping or, not waking up in the other person's body, or the things that they're doing to try and sabotage each other, I think is also, I think just brings that sadness throughout the film as well. I thought, and sort of how they are, all of the, the men around them, it's just like how they're being pitted against each other because of how their immediate circumstances, how the industry around them is forcing them to think about each other. So they're really just feeling like a product of their circumstance.
Yeah, how they're told to participate in this world and all of that too.
Yeah, it's really compelling to me. I mean, I know we've been talking about how there's a lack of subtlety to the commentary here, but I will say there is something so riveting to me about the idea of Elizabeth invoking this younger version of herself because of these insecurities that have risen because of the toxicity of the industry, how they look at women once they reach a certain age and threshold, which is, what makes that whole lunch sequence obviously disgusting. And again, if it's going to be thematically disgusting, we might as well make it physically as well. The uncomfortable close up there on Harvey is
Which
something. It is
in a weird
really,
way, as much as
really
it made me
gross.
never want to eat shrimp again.
Oh, it's absolutely
I,
gross.
I did crave some chicken wings after this one, though.
Oh yeah.
But you know, that idea that Elizabeth is wanting to tap into this youthfulness that starts to haunt her at a certain point, because that youthful spirit wants to stay alive, like it wants to take over her life. And the idea of letting that take over your life, when you think about the physical ramifications of Elizabeth, it's interesting what Fargeat might be saying in terms of that internal battle and what that does to someone at a soulful level. Again, you know, when you can couple that with the arresting imagery here and the symbolism that we see on the surface, I think there is a lot to parse there and a lot to discuss as far as how far we should let that be a part of our lives. You know, at a certain point, does acceptance of our age and our beauty and where we stand, like, you know, where do we draw the line there? And I think ultimately that's why that image of Elizabeth as she lies there dead in her own blood is such a blistering moment in this film, because that is a battle she ultimately loses. Like she ultimately succumbs to the idea that, you know, she wanted this youthful beauty to maybe, you know, be a part of her life in this significant way, to counteract the TV executives and their grossness. And ultimately they kind of win. And maybe that's also what's so heartbreaking about that final image of the film with the blood on the star, and it's just wiped away as if she never existed.
Can I just also say, like, I'm a sucker for movies where the opening and closing shot are the exact same thing.
To say,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
I
just
love
like
it too.
it's such a like weirdly satisfying way to bookend a movie. And in this case, like, it just adds to the whole experience in a way that I really appreciated. So yeah, that final shot's great. The opening shot's great. I was hooked from the opening shot. I love that whole sequence there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that final shot, it just feels like the final punchline, the final, as if everything wasn't bad enough. Nobody's gonna remember this.
I feel like Coralie Fargeat is also playing with expectation with that final shot, when you have that last remaining piece of Elizabeth crawling to her Hall of Fame star, which almost mirrors John Carpenter's The Thing in a way. I was half expecting something like a bicycle to just run over it, and it doesn't do that. It actually does something a bit more devastating in the way it concludes that particular arc, which I did not expect.
I think that's
I think that was
really
deliberate
clever
on
way
her
to do
part.
it.
Yeah, I think that was very deliberate to play with expectation in a way that you might think about, but it definitely goes a different direction, which I liked.
Yeah, definitely adds to the sorrow of this film deeply.
No, it's a perfect way to end it for sure.
Yeah. Any final thoughts that you guys have on the substance?
If I have to critique anything, I did not like some of those shots that mirrored The Shining. Those are the only things I didn't really care for. And it's only because for a movie like this that's very blunt and also has a lot of homages, I think there is a big difference between blunt homage and blunt ripoff. And those sequences were too close to the ripoff category for me. They're very few and far between, but they are so distinct. Like they feel like very different things than the homages we see throughout the rest of the film that have their own personalities to them. Like the shots of the bathroom, the shots of the hallway, the shots of the blood splattering the hallway at the end. It's so The Shining to the point that I just couldn't help but think of The Shining that I temporarily left the movie until I was brought back in. But that's like maybe 30 seconds out of a 2 hour and 20-minute movie that I was temporarily disconnected from it. But the film clearly still did the work to bring me back in pretty instantaneously. So it's barely a critique, but I'm gonna have to throw a few things at the movie that's it's not perfect. It's not my favorite movie of the year, but it's certainly one of them.
You know, I think honestly, to that point, I feel as if it's totally understandable if anyone has an issue with how close the homages and references are, because it's not just The Shining. I mean, I mentioned earlier that depot where Elizabeth gets the supplies is straight out of 2001: A Space Odyssey. That is equally as close of an homage. Or you think about a lot of the body horror here is clearly inspired by Cronenberg and John Carpenter. If you've seen any of their movies, there's so much that is evident. I mean, even Frankenstein, there's so much that this film is doing that is very evident in that approach from a craft perspective, that if you have an issue with it, I understand, but there's so much of it here that I just kind of went with the film. Like, none of it bothered me because it's just so brazen in that regard.
You're right. There is so much of it. I still think there's a difference between homage and ripoff. And I think like the sequence in that you're talking about mirroring 2001: A Space Odyssey, that still feels like homage to me. The scenes at her office feel like ripoffs to me. Like there is a distinction between the two. I sensed something different between them.
That's fair. I did not. They felt so close to the original product for me in both circumstance. But again, I understand why anyone would feel that way about this movie. Yeah.
But aside from that, the movie rocks.
Yeah. Anything else for you, Matt?
Yeah. Only other thing that I think there's some pitfalls that I feel like this movie could have easily fallen into with the sort of the in the spirit of it, kind of almost, which I honestly didn't even realize until it was mentioned, that it is often kind of made it feels like you're watching a silent film. There's really not a lot of dialogue.
Yeah.
The film does. When I first watched it, I was like, oh, I hope they don't try to like explain, like, because there's obviously like with the substance, try to like, oh, we're gonna take down like the people who created this product, or we're gonna try to explain the or try to give some more explanation to that.
The underworld is left completely a mystery.
Yeah, and I just love that about it, and it just really puts the focus on Elizabeth and Sue and their relationship to each other, rather than trying to build out explanations for things that we don't really need. So that wasn't something that I was super conscious of, honestly, till when I watched it again. I was like, this movie could have really easily just tried to explain so much about this substance that it just chooses not to, and I thought that was a really great choice.
Yeah, the substance cinematic universe. I think we all would not want that.
I think what you're talking about there, Matt, is really important as it relates to the discourse of this movie, because there are so many tweets out there that are poking holes in the plotting and the narrative here, and good luck with that, because you're going to be here all day if that's something you want to do with this film, because there's so much that this film just doesn't care to get into. Like, another aspect that I noticed that I thought was kind of funny, because like earlier in the film, there's like 3 different circumstances where Elizabeth gets a message from the organization that's doing all of this, saying that there are supplies available. So on screen, all we see is Elizabeth going to the depot, getting the supplies and coming back. But there's a stretch of this film where she is unconscious, lying in that closet. We're told that it's 3 months later, and how she survives. Like, if you really want to nitpick this, like, how does Sue know where to go? Because we hadn't seen that. Like, as far as we know, Sue had no idea where to get any of those supplies. And it's not
that's
something
convenience
that bothers...
at the movie. Yeah, I didn't. The movie needs that kind of conflict in order to get to its proper resolution.
Exactly.
It's like if we criticize that, we might as well criticize every M. Night Shyamalan movie now. It's like sometimes you need to get around that.
My point in all of that is to say there are lots of things like that the film just overlooks, that if you want to poke holes in the narrative here, you're going to be here all day. There's so much of it. And it doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me at all. Like, I'm glad the film forgoes all of that, because it isn't interested in being a streamlined narrative. This is a modern day fairy tale. That's what this is. So it focuses on that. and its symbolism and its commentary, these characters, how they service that. And everything else falls through the cracks. So, the people out there that are getting too caught up in, how does this substance work? How does Sue know what to do? How does Elizabeth, this or that? Like, I mean, good luck, I guess. I can't find the energy to get bogged down in that stuff when the film doesn't care.
This is a topic we can actually focus on for a while, on maybe a full episode, JD. Film criticism and plot mechanics are not the same thing. Like should be a completely different discussion.
Yeah, especially when you're looking at something like Intent.
Yeah.
This is a film that is acting as a fairy tale. It's not trying to be a streamlined, conventional, dramatic narrative. If it was, and there are things that are important and overlooked, then sure, we can offer those criticisms. But it isn't trying to be that. It's trying to be this allegory. And I think it is extremely successul at that. So why do I care about the mystery of the substance? Like, why do I care how Sue survives 3 months without Elizabeth at all? I just don't care.
I appreciate when filmmakers make up their own rules to get to their points. Honestly, I do. Like that shows conviction. In this case, that shows passion.
It works. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the idea of Elizabeth being out for 3 months, we know there's going to be massive ramifications to that. So as a fairy tale, how do we transition? Like when we see Elizabeth next, we know something massive is about to happen.
Oh no, yeah, it's like when we see 3 months later. Yeah,
exactly. So that's what's most important.
It's almost a punchline.
Yeah, the logic of it all isn't what we should be concerned with, and seeing people get bogged down in that stuff. Like I'm not. Good luck, I guess.
I did not see this movie with a full crowd. I saw it with maybe only 3 or 4 other people in the theater, but it was they were clearly engaged with the film, and the couple behind me made a few audible noises during some of the more visceral parts of the movie, which I kind of liked hearing that. But when 3 months later popped up on the screen, the husband went, "Uh-oh." like it's so it's like that just kind of proves your point, JD. That the fact that 3 months later happens, it's almost like a joke. Like it's
something
part
bad's
of the
about
rule
to happen.
breaking. Yeah.
And that's where the film gets to have its cake and eat it too. And I think that is the beauty of the storytelling here and the hyper focus on the fairy tale and less on the logic. I did not give any care whatsoever to the logic of it all. And I think as a fairy tale, it's extremely effective in that regard.
Sure.
And, I obviously saw this over the weekend, and perhaps that is maybe a little bit of the difference between you and I, Brendan. But as I noted on the main show this week, I saw this with a full crowd. There was not an empty seat in my theater.
So envious of you, man.
And it was incredible because people were very similarly engaged. And it certainly made for a fun experience, for sure.
Dang.
Yeah, there were people. When I saw it at Toronto, there were multiple people that were like, "This is too much." I think maybe 2 or 3 people walked out, but people were really into it. And then when I saw it this past weekend, I think there's this girl she just walked out with her friends, and she was like in tears. She was like absolutely wrecked by the end of the movie. Because one of the workers was like, "What movie did you guys just walked out of?" And we were like, "Oh, The Substance." And he was like, "Did not expect that kind of reaction." So it's interesting to see like people have there's such a wide range of reactions I feel like you can have.
I agree for sure. I absolutely see why that variety would be there. No doubt about it.
Cool movie.
Awesome movie. Yeah. Very good stuff. I guess with that, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment below. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us in Session Film on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Letterboxd. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com as well. Matt, thanks so much for being here. This was a pleasure, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Yes. Tell us about all you do, all the great work you do online. Where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, so I'm currently writing for The Rolling Tape. I write for Geek Vibe Nations, and I'm also just starting to write for Offscreen Central. You can find me at Twitter at 6mattminton14 and Letterboxd at the Cinema Lover. And I just moved out to LA, so hopefully I will not be encountering the substance anytime soon. And we will try to figure out LA.
Yeah.
Unless we're talking to the younger version right now.
Oh yeah, I guess you would. You never know.
We'd never know. No.
Yeah, that's true. We don't know. Yeah, we're big fans of all three of those sites.
Yeah.
So please go and check out Matt's work there. Be sure to follow on social media, Letterboxd, all that fun stuff. Yeah, I really do appreciate you being here, Matt. This was a ton of fun. Do want to reiterate that episode 603 is available. We talked about our top 10 non-Disney, non-Pixar, non-Ghibli animated films of the 21st century so far. It was a great time. And as we noted earlier, Brendan and I are one. We are the substance. We're one.
That's the most interesting byproduct of the substance, that the older version's only 4 years older than the younger version.
Exactly. Our substance wasn't as effective. There was something wrong with ours.
Ours was contaminated.
Exactly. I want a refund. No, it was a great time. Go check it out. We have a review of Transformers 1 available right now as well. And we'll have a review for His Three Daughters coming soon as well. So busy week on the podcast. Be sure to subscribe and check out all of that stuff. Before we get out of here, Matt, do you have any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
Just thanks so much for having me. And if you're listening, definitely check this out with, hopefully, the film has legs at the box office. Try to see this with the biggest crowd that you can, because I think that's the way to see it.
Yeah, I'll echo that too. I hope to see it have some legs, especially given the fact that it's a movie distribution. So I don't really know what that means long term. We should see what that means. But yeah, I hope it has some legs.
Yeah, and we did talk about that a little bit on 603 this week. But I guess to Matt's point, please go see it in a theater if you can. If you can, for whatever reason, if Mubi decides to only have it in theaters for a week and then they're going to pull it, then when it drops on Mubi, invite as many people over to your house as you can and have like 20 of you sit around in your living room and watch this movie. Like, just recreate the experience as much as you can.
I kind of hope that happens, because it might lead to a cult following for this movie pretty soon. It might have, people might start having their own substance viewing parties where they're giving out green syringes of, alcohol and things like that.
Well, because I think maybe that's an exercise you do anyway. Because I think what's fascinating about that, to something you guys were saying earlier, watching this in a crowded theater and seeing everyone's reactions are really fun. I had a great time doing that, but like Matt said, it's interesting how one person might respond differently. You could have another person really crying and having a visceral reaction to it. Another person over here might be entertained. When you have a group of 20 friends in your house watching this, when it's over, it'll be fun to be able to just talk about it with everyone and have that immediate intimacy and feedback right away. I think could be, because I'm not talking to strangers I'm in a theater with often. I don't know if that's something you guys do, but I don't.
No, it's happened a few times, but it's very rare.
Yeah, I don't speak to people often. But if I had a bunch of friends over, I would love to have that conversation. That I think would be an interesting exercise. So at any rate, with all of that said, thanks, Matt, for being here. This was a pleasure. Had a great time. We'll definitely have to have you back.
Absolutely.
Be sure to go and check out 603, Transformers 1, all that fun stuff. And we will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast.